Welcome to Caribbean Tea. From St. Vincent, Kendall Morgan in Georgetown, Guyana, Dennis Chabral, and I am Vivian Williams in New York.
The police have clearly demonstrated, one, that they cannot be trusted. And if you can't trust the police, what's going to happen to the citizens?
Crime continues to cast a long and painful shadow over the Caribbean. Its effects on families and entire communities is indescribable. Beyond the immediate harm to victims, crime erodes the social fabric, deepens fear, and hinders economic growth. It is tearing apart lives and leaving bloodstains and scars across communities. For those whose lives have been made a nightmare, the ineffectiveness of law enforcement and the justice system is pouring salt on wounds. Lack of confidence in the authorities and a sense of injustice are most painfully felt in the case of an 11-year-old girl whose lifeless body was fished out of a hotel pool in Guyana. A family outing at a popular hotel turned tragic when the 11-year-old girl disappeared. What happened after a missing child report was filed breaks the heart of an entire nation, leaving it on edge. People have lost confidence in the very institutions meant to protect them, raising urgent questions about accountability, leadership, and the future of security in the region.
The family deserves answers, and the people of this country deserve answers.
I think the Guyanese people are tired of talking. The Guyanese people are tired of excuses. The Guyanese people need action.
Our guest, Professor Ivelaw Griffith, a renowned scholar in Caribbean security, governance, and criminology, with decades of research and leadership experience. Paul Slowe, a seasoned security specialist and former Assistant Commissioner of Police in Guyana, known for his deep expertise in law enforcement. Let's set the stage. What really is the state of crime in the Caribbean? The graph up there shows the countries where it is high. Looking at the statistics, I know Mr. Slowe has some questions with respect to the reporting of the statistics, whether or not it is accurate, suggesting that there might even be a more serious situation. Lay the scene for us looking at the statistics. How grim or how serious is the issue of crime in the region?
Well, thank you, Vivian. But it's very, very serious indeed because, as is being said, it impacts the entire society. And we must remember, we're not only talking, when you look at the statistics, I have questions about the reporting, because in Guyana, for example, when they report on serious crimes, there are only 12 categories of serious crimes that they report on. And several other crimes that we will consider very serious are not captured in that matrix. So right away, there are some questions there. But then we must remember too that we're not only talking about crime in itself, but in many of the societies, we're talking about the fear of crime. People, you look and what you call, for example, house nows that are, you have to grill your houses because of the fear. You have to make sure you have closed circuit cameras. So apart from the loss of property that we're talking about an additional cost that relates to security, where you have to make sure that your property is even more secure to prevent these crimes.
Gentlemen, can we perhaps begin with a look at one of the more recent concerns about the growing crime rate in the Caribbean? Some criminals may be among the many Caribbean nationals being sent back home under the Trump administration's stepped-up deportation policy. This is expected to put some burden on the financial and law enforcement resources in our already under-resourced Caribbean, especially to rehabilitate and reintegrate these sometimes hardened criminals back into society. How significant do you see this matter with regard to the Caribbean crime situation?
Let me begin by thanking you, Kendall, and Vivian for the invitation to join this important conversation, a conversation that resonates not only in a few Caribbean countries, but across the region in its entirety. The matter of crime and violence is one of the perennial challenges of the Caribbean. Perennial not only in the extent to which it has over time persisted, but it has also manifested itself in the highest form of criminality, the highest form of criminality that has finality to it. I'm talking about homicides. And if you were to do a survey of the region writ large on homicides, you'll find mostly not so good news. There is some good news. In Jamaica recently, the crime homicide rate has come down. But I think there's a perennial element to it. And what makes it a challenge is not only the persistence. Part of the challenge is because it's a multidimensional phenomenon. The crime is not driven only by economic deprivation. It is driven by greed. It is driven by drug operations, both in the trafficking and the sale within Caribbean countries. It is also driven by some social behaviors. Now, sometimes the focus on the homicides allow us to undervalue other elements of crime. Domestic violence is a severe element of the criminality in the Caribbean. So we're talking about a phenomenon that has region-wide resonance, that has been a perennial challenge for years, but in the context of what we are all about in the Caribbean, we are not allowed to give up on managing criminality.
I wanted to zero in a bit on the gangs and the organized criminal groups in the Caribbean, because it seems to be a Caribbean-wide phenomenon. And perhaps it may be related to some of the economic challenges that some of the region faces. But I wonder to what extent this is proving to be a problem that is challenging our administrations across the Caribbean.
The guns and gangs nexus allows us to appreciate not only the homicides, but the terror that is visited in some societies. But I would argue that the problem of gangs is not a region-wide problem. It is a problem that is significant in a few jurisdictions. Important jurisdictions, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Haiti, but in most of the other Caribbean territories, you don't have formalized gangs. You have a lot of wannabe bad men organizing episodically. So there is, for me, a comfort to be taken in the fact that the gangs problem is not a region-wide problem, as we often get the impression from the media. What is driven by reporting in Jamaica and in Haiti and in Trinidad and Tobago, part of Trinidad and Tobago's existing state of emergency, has to do with that strong nexus between guns and gangs. But I think it's important in talking about the guns part to acknowledge upfront the guns part manifests some of the transnationality of the criminality in the region. Because when you ask the question, where are most of the guns coming from? Not coming from within the Caribbean, coming from outside the Caribbean, mostly from the United States.
I have a question about the guns, but I just wanted to jump back in about the gangs and the definition, because I've heard debate about how do you classify gangs in the context of the criminal activity in the region. And so you, what I'm getting from you is that in some of the countries, there are in fact organized gangs, but in other cases, these are just groups of criminals coming together. Are you drawing that distinction?
Yes, I am. If you were to take St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I would bet you $200 of Vivian's money. You cannot identify a list of 10 gangs or even 5 gangs. You got a number of individuals who are wannabe gangsters, who are bad men, who rob, who rape, who commit crimes. But a gang is a formalized, organized arrangement of individuals, invariably with an intent to pursue an economic or a criminal enterprise unrelated to economics. You find those in places that I've mentioned, in Trinidad and Tobago. And the reporting is, evidence is that some of these gangs are led by women. So the gender dynamics are also there, but I don't think that it is true to represent the region as gang infested. Jamaica has gangs, historic challenges of gangs. And I spent a part of this book looking at Trinidad and Tobago, the state of emergency of 2011, and the Dulles Affair of 2010. Manifestation of gangs and guns and drugs, criminality writ large. But I don't think, if you were to go to St. Lucia, you were to go to Grenada, you were to go to the Turks and Caicos, put together a list of 10 gangs.
On that note, I want to switch now to our video. I want you to take a look at this video and then invite comments about it.
We have seen gun violence trend, not only here, but globally, reminding us of the fragile nature of our peace. Zero tolerance for guns and drug abuse must not only be engaged and articulated by law enforcement, but across our society, in our institutions, in our homes, and indeed, yes, on our blocks.
We're going to do more. In fact, every day now we're approving visa revocations, and if that visa led to a green card, the green card process as well. And here's why. It's very simple. When you apply to enter the United States and you get a visa, you are a guest. And you're coming as a student, you're coming as a tourist, or what have you. And in it, you have to make certain assertions. And if you tell us when you apply for a visa, I'm coming to the U.S. to participate in pro-Hamas events, that runs counter to the foreign policy interest of the United States of America. It's that simple. So you lied. You came, if you had told us that you were going to do that, we never would have given you the visa. Now you're here. Now you do it. So you lied to us. You're out.
That's the Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, talking about the deportation of persons in the United States and the Trump administration's stance on it. Particularly, he is referencing the mass deportation in what some may say in defiance of a court's order. And these are violent gangs returning to Venezuela. And I'd like to bring the discussion back now. Professor Griffith, you indicated that we really don't have a gang problem across the region, that it might be limited to a concentrated set of states. Are we entering into a new era?
The simple answer is maybe. But before coming to the response apropos your question, I want to make one observation. I beg to differ with the Secretary of State. It is not simply a matter of people who were alleged to be in relation to Hamas. If you ask the question, how many people sent back to the Caribbean or beginning to be sent back or intending to be sent back to the Caribbean have anything to do with Hamas, I guess I'm going to bet Paul Slowe's money. You'll find very little. There is a broader agenda, and that broader agenda goes beyond people identified as criminals connected to gangs. But even if you were to focus on that part of the map of criminality where gang relationship of countries in the global south are involved, yes, we have the potential makings of a problem in the Caribbean. I suspect you're not going to find too many gang members from the CARICOM countries sent back. You'll find criminals of all kinds. You'll find people whose criminality has to do with the visa violation, not any homicide or robbery or rape. There are going to be some of those in the mix. But here is where the potential problem lies. Some of the gang members sent back to Venezuela. Because of the circumstances in Venezuela, they're not going to stay in Venezuela. They're going to move to Trinidad and Tobago. They're going to move to Guyana. They have already been moving to Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. They're going to move to Colombia. In other words, they're going to complicate the law enforcement and national security lives of proximate states. And so the folks in Guyana have to begin to prepare for eventualities of that kind. Folks in Trinidad and Tobago have to prepare for eventualities. They also have to prepare for people who are being sent back to their jurisdictions who are not criminals in the gang-related sense. And keep in mind that this business of deportation is not new. Remember the 1990s and the 2000s, where a lot of the deportations had to do with drug criminality, organized criminality because of drugs? I have the data in another book showing the thousands sent back to Jamaica from the United States, from Europe, from Canada. There was an unfortunate circumstance involving Guyana and Canada. Canada took all these deportees, dumped them off at Chedijagan International Airport, and took off. They later apologized, but guess what? They did not take them back. So it is not only who are coming back to your direct jurisdiction at Jamaica, at Grenada, at St. Lucia. The entire Caribbean have people who are allegedly on that list to be deported. So you have the problems in the making with many dimensions to it, Vivian.
The problem with the criminals is that when they get back, remember they have links. Many of these people would have established criminal links. Those links are not going to go away because they have been deported to Guyana or wherever else. And experience has shown that they are going to perhaps take a little time, but they're going to set back up whatever criminal network they have, whether it's to smuggle drugs, whether it's to smuggle guns, whatever the crime that they are being involved in, they are going to try to continue to be involved in those crimes. And when you look at the capacity of some of the law enforcement agencies in the Caribbean, it is clear that they are not equipped to deal with the sophistication of some of these crimes. So I can very well anticipate that they're going to have some serious issues. And I hope that the governments and the law enforcement agencies in particular are sitting down and planning how they are going to deal with this. It's good to say that you're going to take them back, but once they come back, what are you going to do with them?
Do you think the Caribbean could make a case to the U.S. authorities for some support, financial, and also in terms of human resources in the security area to beef up their own capacity to deal with this threat that you have so vividly explained, and that sounds rather challenging, having to deal with the transnational movement of the criminal deportees through the region. Well, primarily Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, but of course there's nothing stopping them from moving further through the region. Do you think that the region, as it continues to try to engage the U.S. about deportees and about other policies of the Trump administration that are likely to impact the region, that they should be trying to make a case for some sort of support to beef up their security response?
Caribbean countries are free to make the case, but I suspect the case will not get much attention. I'll tell you why. There is, within the current United States political dispensation, very little tolerance for aid. And one of the things that is going to be impacting Caribbean jurisdictions, and especially in relation to deportees, is a cutbacks and the ending of U.S. aid support. Many of the U.S. aid projects are projects organized by nonprofit organizations, social groups. And in the early incarnation of deportation, those social groups, those organizations, local organizations, using U.S. aid money, helped to do some integration of citizens, helped along. I have in an earlier book the specific organizations in several jurisdictions. With the absence of that US aid funding, the stress is going to be even greater. And so whether it is for US aid on deportees or whether it is for security concerns generally, I don't think there's much tolerance in the United States administration to help. My fear is that in the context of the cutbacks, there are a number of programs that are benefiting Caribbean countries on the security law enforcement front that will be victims. The Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. In the first Trump administration, had it not been for congressional action to restore the proposed cuts by the administration, CBSI would have been devastated. I anticipate cuts to CBSI. Some of that CBSI funding goes to the regional security system. I suspect the RSS funding is going to be cut. So I think that there is onus on Caribbean countries to find ways in which by themselves, collectively, and reaching to other strategic partners to find ways to cope. I don't think there is much of a tolerance for further aid to help you with your deportees or other challenges.
Okay. I want to jump into with a question from Mr. Slowe on a point he raised earlier about the underreporting. And I wondered if it may be connected as well to the approach taken by some of our citizens, particularly in depressed areas, the distrust of the security agencies, and also a high dependence in some cases, and especially in some of the larger Caribbean territories, on some of the criminal organizations for financial support for some of the households in some of those communities. In your experience, have you seen that, do you think that is connected perhaps to the underreporting of crimes and the fact that perhaps it's even embraced in some of these communities, the criminal activities?
And from my experience, the underreporting comes about because of a lack of confidence in the system. But that's one. People believe that you're making a report, nothing's going to happen, especially when it's a situation where the perpetrator might be one who is considered to be influential or has some entity that is influential in the society. People believe making a report is not going to make any sense, and therefore they avoid doing that. The other dimension to that is that when they categorize serious crimes, as I alluded to earlier, it's a very narrow category. In Guyana, is about 12 categories of crime that they consider as serious crimes. And when they report on crimes, they report on serious crimes. And as I've said, a very narrow category. So many other categories, especially white-collar categories, are not being reported. And we all know, and I'm sure we can understand, that some of those crimes have devastating impact on the economy. And it leads to the very situation where the people below are deprived of resources, which sometimes forces them to go and commit criminal acts. So it's not that because of, as you suggested, maybe the agencies are indebted to some of these people, but it's just that in many cases people feel they have no confidence based on perhaps not only their own experiences, but what they read and what people might have told them. It doesn't make sense to go. People will tell you that only the other day you see a report, you make a report, and sometimes hours to have a proper response, and therefore people feel it doesn't worth it. And then one should not discount the slothful nature of the whole process. Because people know that if you're going to report and you want to pursue the matter in court, it might take years, and then you have to be up and down, take time from your job. So it's just more than just one issue. It's a combination of issues that will lead to the underreporting of crimes.
There are a few things that I think we need to consider and we should bring to the attention of the audience with respect to crime. One, we see alarming rise in the rate of crime in the Caribbean region and its neighbors in Latin America. We also see an aggressive policy by the Trump administration to deport criminals back into the region, which would result in the region seeing unprecedented levels of criminals returning to join those that are currently existing in the region. But what is also important is the level of food price inflation in Latin America and the Caribbean. If you look at the graph on the screen, you could see how this inflation skyrocketed over the last 4 years. And there is empirical evidence to show that there is a relationship between the levels of inflation and what is referred to as economic misery and the levels of crime, particularly property crimes, which are the type of crimes that Mr. Slowe and Professor Griffith are talking about. There is also empirical research that say for every 14 deportee, the homicide rate is likely to increase by 1 annually. Now, with these factors into consideration, I would like to hear from you, starting with you, Mr. Slowe, from an operational level. Are Caribbean governments missing something, and what, if any, new approach you think should be adopted?
Well, as you pointed out, the inflation is a reality. You can't escape that. You go around and prices have gone up, earnings have remained stagnant or has reduced in many cases. And people in many situations are desperate. People are desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. We must never discount the fact that many people who are going to be involved in the what we call petty crimes, sometimes they are forced to do so because of economic circumstances. It's not to encourage what they do, but it is the reality. A person who has a family to feed and who works for a minimum wage and the prices keep going up might be tempted to commit what we call property crime. He might be tempted to do so. And therefore, I think the whole situation of the economics need to be addressed. People need to be provided with what we call a livable wage. And it is I expected that if a person gets a livable wage, then they're not going to resort, the average man is not going to resort to crime. So inflation, the economics, those things are very, very important to consider. And we must also remember, again, I want to point out that many of the types of crime are not a result of any need, it's a result of greed and the opportunity that is presented for these people to steal, and they steal. And we're talking here not about a man who's going to steal to feed his family, but we're talking about a man who is in a position to steal millions because he is in that position, and therefore we should not overlook that. So yes, while inflation perhaps impact the people at the low end more than the people at the middle and above, all are going to be impacted, and therefore when we look at solutions, we have to take all of that into consideration. Because I close by saying some of the very persons who are responsible for enforcing the law and take action, they too are suffering because of the situation.
Professor Griffith?
Well, let me make two quick observations. I think the problem of price inflation is connected to another underreported criminal part of the criminality portrait. You know what that underreported crime is that affects prices? Prideal larceny. The theft of agricultural products. There are some jurisdictions that do a fairly good job in keeping that on the radar, Jamaica being one. But there are so many jurisdictions, including Guyana, including Jamaica, including Trinidad and Tobago, where theft of agricultural products, property, is a challenge. And guess what? The people who manage that agricultural enterprise they pass the cost of the theft on to the consumers. The product at the end that you pay for is a reflection not only of what are the inputs for the agricultural produce, it's a reflection of the cost lost by the people who grow and produce. When you thief a whole lot of stuff from them, they got to find some way to make back some money. They pass the price off. But here is something else that is part of, and it's not true only for the Caribbean and Latin America. This thing that happened beginning in February 24, 3 years ago, has been impacting us. The war in the Ukraine. Ukraine is among the world's largest producers of wheat and barley and potash and fertilizers of all costs. And that production impact, because of the war, has been sending a domino effect on prices of agricultural products across the world. It affects also Latin America and the Caribbean. You know, I want to come back to something that Paul mentioned, and that is the skepticism about the veracity of the data. The evidence is that what are represented as a criminal portrait is only the reported crimes.
Correct.
There's some communities where there's a skepticism about the criminal justice system. People know that the police force doesn't have, some fairly economically viable communities have so few police cars that some citizens don't bother to call the police. It takes them a while to get there. If there is an arrest, the judicial architecture is so lethargic, it takes a long time for justice to be brought. So in many communities, people don't even bother to call the police, don't even bother to report a crime. Yeah. They meet vigilante justice as a way. So I fully embrace the proposition that what we have been portraying is not the totality of criminality, it's the reported crimes. But there is another element of the criminality that I think also doesn't get enough attention, which is the consequences of the government's limitations. You go, and I spent 2.5 wonderful hours with the police high command here in Grenada yesterday. And one of the points I made to them, and it relates to one of those underreported, under-discussed issues, is a significant growing number of private security. Many jurisdictions, you have more private security than the police. Why is it? Individual citizens don't trust and have confidence in the system, they hire private security. Now, the private security, especially hired by the businesses, they're not absorbing the costs of maintaining those private security arrangements. They're passing the costs on. So there's a double whammy effect insofar as the criminality is concerned, particularly when you factor in the private security arrangements. There are places, and I won't call them, where private security is hired by people who reject it from the police and the defense force. And they go practice some of the criminality that they try to practice in the police or the army as private security.
Professor Griffith, I want to explore this institutional issue that we have, the institutional challenge. Here is a portrait of the murder rates in countries in the Caribbean or the Association of Caribbean States. And you could see the countries where there is a high level of homicides in the country. Now we look at the prison population and we find that the countries where there is the higher level or highest level of serious crimes have the lowest level or at the bottom in terms of prison population per 100,000 inhabitants shown here on the graph. Is this an indication or evidence of what you're talking about, of the of the institutional problem to detect and to apprehend, and also the legal process of convicting and then incarcerating those that are responsible for crime in the region? And I put this both to you, Professor Griffith, and Mr. Slowe.
Well, let me jump in here. Let me jump in here to say perhaps this is a clear indication of what we're talking about, because you have countries with the high rates of criminal activities, but as this graph is showing, those very countries have very small prison populations. Maybe there's a suggestion that the crime is prevalent, but the arrest, prosecution, and conviction is very low. And I think this is rather revealing.
The prison dimension is part of the broader capabilities limitation of the institutions at a variety of levels. I was researching a book called Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, and part of that research, I visited several prisons in the Caribbean. One of the prisons that I attempted to spend a day at, and I couldn't spend the entire day, Kendall, was a Port of Spain main prison. I will bet you $100 of Paul's money, not Guyana dollars, US dollars. You couldn't tell me the year or the time when that prison was created. That prison was created in 1812, the time when the British and the Americans were fighting. The Britain created that prison to house American prisoners. It was built for 250 people. The day I was there were over 800 prisoners. Dramatic overcrowding. What that slide represents is, one, the criminality has been such that given the existing legal mechanisms in countries, there's a lot of directing people who are convicted to prison. It reflects, among other things, insufficient alternatives to prison sentencing. That's something that's changing. But it also represents an insufficient funding of prisons. If you ask most Caribbean prisons, and I can tell you the ones that have some amount of rehabilitation, most Caribbean prisons, they don't have rehabilitation.
True.
They don't have space. They don't have the funds. So the prisons become a revolving door. You come in, you get the first degree in criminality, you come out. You come back in 2 years later, you got a second degree in criminality. So it is a representation of the limitations. It is a representation of the funding limitations. And I'll tell you what is a potential good news already begun to manifest itself in some jurisdictions, notably in Trinidad and Tobago. The modifications regarding the laws about ganja ownership and possession has led several jurisdictions, and I have the data about Trinidad and Tobago, to let people out who are just charged for 1 or 2 grams of marijuana.
Yes.
The value of the marijuana they're arrested for and convicted for pales in comparison to how much the government is spending to keep them in prison.
There, yes. Yes.
So when you look at the prison dimension, there are various components of that prison imprisonment. But let me end with this. I invoke a famous Russian author called Fyodor Dostoevsky, who himself had been imprisoned. And I invoke him because of something he said in one of his novels. He said, if you want to know what a civilization thinks of itself, look inside its prisons. If you were to look inside the prisons of the Caribbean, it is not a wholesome picture of the Caribbean civilization. No proper treatment, no attitude that is supportive of rehabilitation. It's a dire situation, and it's part of the broader criminality portrait.
Gentlemen, your final thoughts before we wrap on today's program?
I think that the issue of criminality and crime and violence is not only a perennial challenge, but it is one that's likely to be accentuated in the immediate near term because of circumstances that, as we discussed, are going to be affecting the Caribbean for a while now. But let me say, finally, not only appreciation for the conversation, but there's a conversation that we need to have maybe in a subsequent program about a growing criminal element that very often doesn't get much attention, and that is the business of cybercrime. And as I said in this book, Guyana, because of the oil, will become a magnet for not only general criminality, it will be a magnet for the cybercrime because there's an association, quite understandably, between oil and wealth. And if you're operating a business or if you live in Guyana, you must have money. I got to find a way to get some of it. Cybercrime is on the clear and present danger list, should not be undervalued.
Slowe?
Yeah, I would like to thank you and Vivian for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I think it's when we look at the trend of crime in the Caribbean, it's very, very worrying, especially when we look at homicides and gun crime. It is going in the wrong direction. And I think that the government, CARICOM as a whole, needs to address this issue, and not only address to say that we are looking at it, but to put concrete measures in place to deal with it. We spoke during the course of this podcast about the deportation of criminal and other elements from the US. It is my view that is going to have a negative impact on the situation in the Caribbean and Latin America as a whole. So again, I think that the governments need to address this issue and make sure that measures are put in place to deal. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this podcast.
Paul Slowe and Professor Ivelaw Griffith, our guest on Caribbean Tea this week.